when two officers arrested her. They had no idea they'd face her again, this time in court, as the judge deciding their fate. The late afternoon sun cast golden light over the city park, filtering through the leaves of towering oak trees. A gentle breeze rustled the branches, carrying the laughter of children playing and the distant hum of joggers along the trail. Kaylin Wright sat alone on a wooden bench near the pond. A thick novel rested on her lap, her fingers idly tracing the worn edges of the cover. For once she allowed herself to escape from the weight of her profession. Long days in the courtroom, late nights buried in legal documents. Today she just wanted to read, to breathe. But peace never seemed to last long. The sharp screech of tires shattered the quiet. A police cruiser rolled up to the curb, its flashing lights off, but its presence undeniable. Two officers stepped out, Carter and Maddie. Their movements were measured, their gazes sweeping the area before locking onto Kaylin. She felt their eyes on her before she even looked up. The tension in the air shifted. Other park-goers began to notice, some pausing mid-stride, sensing something out of place. Kaylin turned a page, pretending not to see them approach. But the shadow cast over her book made it impossible to ignore. "Ma'am, may we have a word?" Carter's voice was even, but there was something in his tone, an edge of authority, of expectation. Kaylin sighed, closing her book with deliberate calm. Of course. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this conversation, would change everything. Kaylin kept her expression calm as she placed her book on the bench beside her. The two officers stood before her, their stance firm, exuding an air of silent authority. Maddie's fingers hovered near her utility belt, as if preparing for an escalation that hadn't even begun. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the area," Carter said, his gaze unwavering. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Kaylin raised an eyebrow, genuinely perplexed. "Suspicious activity?" she repeated, glancing around the peaceful park. A few joggers passed by. Some people sat under the shade of trees, and families played on the grass. Nothing seemed out of place. "I'm just reading," she said simply, lifting her book slightly in emphasis. Carter's expression remained unreadable. Maddie took a step closer. "You have any identification on you?" Kaylin exhaled, resisting the urge to scoff. "What exactly am I being accused of?" Maddie's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's just a routine check." A routine check. Kaylin had heard those words before. She had defended cases where routine checks turned into baseless interrogations, where innocent people were treated like criminals for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. A small group of onlookers had started to gather. Some whispered amongst themselves. Others watched in silence. Kaylin forced herself to remain composed. With steady hands, she reached into her bag and retrieved her wallet. She pulled out her driver's license and handed it to Carter. He took his time looking at it. Unnecessarily long. "Kaylin Wright," he read aloud, his voice almost mocking. He tilted his head slightly. "What's your business here, Ms. Wright?" Kaylin's patience thinned. "I live here," she said. "I came to enjoy the park." "Is that a problem?" Maddie's hand rested firmly on her belt now. "Are you alone?" she asked. "Or waiting for someone?" Kaylin's grip on her bag tightened. "I don't see how that's relevant." She had done this dance before. Not personally, but in the courtroom. She knew exactly how it played out. "I'm not answering any more questions," Kaylin said firmly. "Unless you tell me what law I've broken." Carter took a step forward. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped. Kaylin didn't flinch. "Am I free to go?" she asked. Maddie exchanged a glance with Carter. His jaw tightened. And then, in one swift motion, he reached for her wrist. "You're resisting," Carter announced. Kaylin's eyes widened. She hadn't moved, hadn't even lifted a finger. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Cold steel snapped around her wrist before she could react. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A young woman pulled out her phone, hitting record. "Stop resisting," Maddie said, louder this time, her voice carrying across the park. Kaylin's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't resisting. She was just existing. But the narrative was already being written for her. One where she was the aggressor. One where they were in control. The weight of the handcuffs dug into her wrists as they tightened. "This is unnecessary," Kaylin said, her voice steady despite the anger burning in her chest. "You're under arrest for obstruction of an investigation," Carter declared. "What investigation?" Kaylin shot back. But they ignored her. Someone in the crowd shouted, "She didn't do anything," but it didn't matter. Carter and Maddie had already decided how this would go. Kaylin turned her head just before they forced her inside the police car. Her eyes met the young woman filming. An unspoken plea passed between them. Then the car doors slammed shut. The world outside blurred as the cruiser pulled away from the curb. She had spent years fighting for justice in a courtroom. Now she was seeing the system from the other side. She had no doubt this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Kaylin sat in her office, the weight of recent events pressing against her. Stacks of legal documents covered her desk, each one a piece of the battle she was preparing to fight. The viral video of her wrongful arrest had sparked outrage. Messages of support flooded in from colleagues, activists, and strangers alike. But this wasn't about public sympathy. It was about justice. And Kaylin was ready to fight. She had filed a civil rights lawsuit against the officers, Carter and Maddie, along with the police department for unlawful detainment and abuse of power. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The system protected its own. Still, she wasn't backing down. Then came the phone call. Her attorney's voice was measured, but she sensed hesitation. "Kaylin," he began, "I just received word that Carter and Maddie have filed a motion to dismiss your case." She exhaled. But there's something else," he added carefully. Kaylin frowned. "What is it?" There was a pause. "You've been assigned as the judge in one of their cases next month." Silence. The words settled over her like a slow-moving storm. The very officers who had arrested her, who had humiliated her in front of a crowd, who had twisted a simple act of reading into an accusation, would now have to stand before her. A twist of fate, a test of justice. Kaylin leaned back in her chair, processing. "Do you want to recuse yourself?" her attorney asked. Kaylin hesitated. Could she do this? Could she sit in judgment of the same people who had abused their authority against her? She had every reason to step aside, but she had a stronger reason to stay. Justice wasn't about personal vendettas. It was about accountability. "No," she said finally. "I won't recuse myself." Her attorney sighed, but she could hear a note of admiration. "I thought you'd say that." The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom hummed with hushed conversations as people filed into their seats. This wasn't a high-profile case, but word had spread. The irony of the moment was not lost on anyone. At the defense table sat Carter and Maddie, both still in uniform, though their usual confidence seemed dimmed. They leaned toward each other, whispering. Then the door to the judge's chambers opened. The room fell silent. Kaylin stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. She moved with purpose, her expression unreadable as she took her seat. She glanced toward the defendants. The reaction was immediate. Carter's face drained of color. Maddie stiffened, her jaw tightening. It was her, the woman they had dismissed, the woman they had arrested, the woman they had assumed would never have the power to hold them accountable. Kaylin let the moment settle. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she spoke. "This court is now in session." The gavels struck. The officers sat stiffly, their confidence eroding. Carter whispered something to their lawyer, who gave him a sharp look. For the first time in weeks, Kaylin had the upper hand. But this wasn't about revenge. Her job as a judge demanded impartiality, and she would uphold that standard. The attorneys presented their opening arguments. Kaylin listened intently, her pen gliding across her notepad. Every so often her gaze flickered toward Carter and Maddie. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands fidgeted slightly. During a recess, Carter and Maddie stepped into the hallway, their voices low but urgent. "How is she, the judge?" Carter hissed. "This has to be a setup." Maddie shook her head, eyes darting toward the courtroom door. "She's going to bury us." Their lawyer sighed. "It's not a setup, it's coincidence. And you need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here. Your actions are." But they weren't listening. They were too consumed by the surreal nature of their predicament. When court resumed, Kaylin remained composed, ensuring the hearing proceeded fairly and efficiently. Yet her presence alone seemed to unnerve the defendants. Every time she addressed them, they shifted in their seats. Their confidence, once unshakable, was cracking. At one point during witness testimony, Kaylin caught Carter stealing a glance at her. His expression wasn't defiance. It was something closer to regret, as if, for the first time, he was beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Kaylin adjourned the hearing, her gavel striking with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the room emptied, Kaylin lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares. They hesitated near the door, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. For them, this was just another legal battle. For Kaylin, it was something more. It was proof that justice, when given a chance, could come full circle. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filled the gallery. This was supposed to be just another routine misconduct hearing. But today was different. News of the case had spread. The officers on trial, Carter and Maddie, had once been the ones wielding power. Now they sat at the defendant's table, their uniforms feeling more like a burden than a shield. The irony of the moment was not lost on anyone. The gavel struck. The murmurs ceased. Kaylin Wright, now wearing her judge's robe, sat at the bench. Her presence carried weight, authority, and something neither Carter nor Maddie expected: unwavering control. "This court is now in session." Her voice was steady, professional, impartial. But beneath the surface, the significance of this moment wasn't lost on her. She glanced toward the defense table. Carter's face was pale. Maddie shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Kaylin took a breath. She would not let emotion dictate this trial. Not anger, not pride, only justice. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Lewis Grant, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, today's case isn't just about a lapse in judgment." He turned toward the jury. "This is about the blatant abuse of power." His tone was firm, convincing. "The officers seated before you today, Carter and Maddie, are accused of excessive force against an unarmed civilian, Elijah Brooks." He gestured toward the witness stand, where a young man sat, hands clasped tightly. "Elijah, tell the court what happened." Elijah's voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, the fear turned into quiet defiance. "I was driving home," he said. "They pulled me over, said I looked suspicious." Kaylin's fingers curled slightly against the bench. The phrasing was all too familiar. "I gave them my license, answered their questions. But before I knew it, I was being yanked from my car. They threw me to the ground, hard." He swallowed. "I hit my head on the pavement. My ears were ringing. I kept asking what I did wrong. But they didn't answer." A heavy silence settled over the room. The prosecutor nodded. "Elijah, did you resist in any way?" His voice was firm now, I was scared, but I did everything they told me to do. It didn't matter. They had already made up their minds. The defense attorney, James Rollins, rose from his seat. His expression was calm, but there was tension in his jaw. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that force was used, he turned to the jury. We argued that the situation escalated due to the perceived threat to officer safety. Kaylin didn't react. She had heard this argument too many times before. He approached the stand. Elijah, were you moving at all when the officers approached? Elijah frowned. I was taking out my wallet. And the officers, could they have mistaken that for something else? Elijah let out a short, incredulous laugh. You mean, did they think my wallet was a gun? Because that's the only excuse that ever seems to work. Rollins stiffened. No further questions. He sat down. Carter was called first. He adjusted his collar as he took the stand. For the first time, he looked nervous. Officer Carter, the prosecutor began, can you explain why you believed Elijah was a threat? Carter hesitated. I made a judgment call. And do you believe your actions were justified? Carter's eyes darted to Maddie, then back to the prosecutor. At the time, yes. But looking back, I could have handled it differently. The prosecutor's brow lifted. Handled it differently. He leaned forward. By not slamming an unarmed man's head into the pavement? Carter's mouth opened, but no words came out. His silence spoke volumes. Maddie was next. Her tone was more defensive. We didn't intend to hurt anyone, she said. The prosecutor crossed his arms. But you did. Maddie's jaw tightened. I was following procedure. The prosecutor turned to the jury. If excessive force is procedure, then we have a much bigger problem than these two officers. Kaylin took a deep breath. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury's deliberation was short. When they returned, the foreperson stood. We find the defendants. A pause. Guilty. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Kaylin nodded. She turned to the defendants. Officers Carter and Maddie, she said, her voice steady. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve with integrity. When those entrusted with that responsibility abuse their power, the consequences extend beyond just one victim. She paused. The court orders the following: suspension without pay, mandatory retraining in de-escalation tactics, a permanent mark on your records. She held their gaze. This is not revenge, she said. This is accountability. She struck the gavel. This court is adjourned. Carter and Maddie stood. For the first time, they looked shaken. Carter hesitated, then, barely audible, I'm sorry. Kaylin didn't respond. Not because she didn't hear him, but because she knew words meant nothing without action. As the courtroom emptied, a woman approached her. An older woman, voice trembling. Thank you, she whispered, for standing up. Kaylin exhaled. This is just the beginning. And as she stepped outside into the daylight, for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to hope. The courtroom was empty now. The echoes of the gavel's final strike still lingered in the air. Kaylin remained seated at the bench, staring down at the legal documents before her. Justice had been served, at least in the legal sense. But was it enough? The consequences handed down to Carter and Maddie would serve as a lesson. They had been forced to face their own abuse of power, forced to understand that a badge did not place them above accountability. Yet Kaylin knew this case was just a small battle in a much larger fight. She stepped outside the courthouse, the crisp afternoon air hitting her face. A small crowd had gathered. Among them were members of the community, activists, and individuals who had followed her case from the beginning. A woman approached her, an older woman with tired eyes and a soft smile. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with quiet emotion. For standing up, for not letting them get away with it. Kaylin nodded, absorbing the weight of the moment. She had never sought to be a symbol. She had simply refused to be silenced. Nearby, Mary stood waiting. "You did it," she said, her voice light but her eyes knowing. Kaylin sighed. "It shouldn't have taken this much," she admitted. "A viral video, a legal battle, a trial." Mary nodded. "But it's a start." Kaylin looked back at the courthouse. Justice wasn't a single moment. It was a continuous effort. This case had exposed cracks in the system. It had forced a conversation. And for Kaylin, that meant everything. She turned back to Mary, determination set in her eyes. "We have work to do." And with that, she walked forward. Not just away from a courtroom, but toward a future where justice wasn't an exception. It was the rule. Justice is not just about punishment, it is about accountability. Kaylin's story is a testament to the power of resilience, integrity, and the fight against systemic injustice. It highlights the dangers of unchecked authority and the courage it takes to challenge it. Her journey from victim to judge proves that change begins when we refuse to stay silent. This case was not just about two officers. It was about a flawed system that must be reformed. Justice is not a privilege, it is a right, and those who stand for it can create ripples of change that last forever.